Hello, and welcome to Music Ministry by Pam, prayer worship songs and Bible study. This is session 6 in the study of Mark. Last week, we spoke about how Christ called the disciples, and though the disciples were not completely ready with their faith, they followed. And that's an example of how we may not know all the answers, but we get a message from God and we follow. And with each prayer, God gives us additional guidance. This week, we're going to be looking at Christ performing an exorcism, that's casting out demons. Sometimes some people feel that's a scary topic, but what we're going to do is we're going to approach it with knowledge so we can get a greater understanding of the enemy that we have to deal with. Okay, but before we get into that, I'm going to sing my song for today, and it's called The Center of My Joy. Jesus, you're the center of my joy. All that's good and perfect comes from you. You're the heart of my contentment. For all I do, Jesus, you're the center of my joy. When I've lost my direction, you're the compass for my way. You're the fire and light when nights are long and cold. In sadness, you are the laughter that shadows all my fears. When I'm all alone, your hand is there to hold. Jesus, you're the center of my joy. All that's good and perfect comes from you. You're the heart of my contentment, hope for all I do. Jesus, you're the center of my joy. You are why I find pleasure in the simple things in life. You're the music in the meadows and the streams. The voices of the children, my family and my home. You're the source and finish of my highest dreams. Jesus, you're the center of my the center of my joy. Jesus, you are the center of my joy. Jesus, you are the center of my Jesus, you are the center of my joy. Jesus, you are the center of my joy. Jesus, you are the center of my joy. Jesus, you're the center of my joy. Joy of my joy. The center of my joy. That really is a touching song, isn't it? Okay, well, now if you would, let's take out our scriptures. And once again, it's in Mark. We know Mark writes a small amount. There's a lot of meaning behind it, a lot to investigate. So let's begin. We're in Mark chapter 1, and we'll be starting verse 21. And the subtopic is called Jesus Teaches with Great Authority. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Just then, a man in the synagogue who was possessed by an evil spirit cried out, "What do you want with me, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to condemn us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," Jesus said sternly. "Come out of him." The evil spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching? And with authority. He even gives orders to evil spirits, and they obey him." News about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. And that completes our reading for today. Okay. Well, there's lots of different things different topics that we can discuss when we start to study scripture. I'm going to try to cover as much as I can and pray that God leads and guides me as we proceed with our study. So let's look at the first section. Jesus went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to preach. So we've studied before that Capernaum is the new home where Jesus is living. Capernaum is not a small city. It's an international hub because there was a lot of trade that was going on there. The interesting thing is because there's a lot of trade, that means there's a lot of people from different locations with different faiths and different beliefs. So already we're seeing a different perspective, how Christ is not only gearing himself towards the disciples, he's gearing himself to the whole of mankind. Okay, so now Jesus is going to It's going to a synagogue. Couldn't think of that word. Okay, so Jesus is going to a synagogue and he's going to preach. So uh, the ability to read was mostly held by people who had an upper class. The average, uh, the average worker and the average person did not know how to read. So when they went to the synagogue, that was because those those priests were more learned in being able to read the scripture, and then they would read the scripture, teach them what the rules were, in other words, the laws and the interpretation of the law. And that was how people knew about what was in scripture. They most of the time didn't have access to read it for themselves. So, with that in mind, that gives you a very different concept of things. When you can read something for yourself, you can take from it the information that you want. But when you have to rely upon somebody else to read it, then you are also relying upon their interpretation. Okay, so that was a kind of a limiting experience for most of the common people. So the rabbis taught the law and they supported that teaching by saying, and this rabbi says so and so and so. So, but this rabbi says so and so and so. But you could tell from that kind of teaching that it's kind of stiff. So when Christ came, Christ, who knows all about the law, was able to teach with much more persuasiveness, with much more liveliness, and much more, I guess you could say, personality, because it was different. It wasn't just repeating what was printed, it was coming from the fact that Jesus is God. And the people perceived that. They could tell this was something different. This person was somebody different. So now, how did it come to be that Jesus was able to go to the synagogue and preach like that? Well, synagogues had a procedure where visiting rabbis came to preach. So when Jesus came, it kind of fell into line that he would be able to preach there. What was taught there was the Old Testament. And we know the Old Testament is based upon laws, okay? Oh, all right. Now, let's go back to um, the city of Capernaum. Capernaum was a thriving city. It was occupied by the Romans. And so that means that there was a lot of wealth, a lot of sin, and a lot of decadence. Okay, so that means people partaking or participating in a lot of sins of the flesh, from overeating to overindulgence sexually. You could run the gamut because that's what was being experienced there. And you also had the Roman influences of their worshiping pagan gods. So, pagan God, the one true God, there's a challenge right there. Now, when Jesus taught with authority, the rabbis taught, as I was saying before, laws, and they interpreted when there was a violation of the law. But part of the extreme with the rabbis is God gave a set of laws, the rabbis decided that they were going to further that, increase that. And the rabbis created over 600 more laws. Now, why were the laws really given in the first place? Because once the children of Israel came out of Egypt, they needed some structure. How are they going to live? And God used the laws to help the people establish a foundation of how to act, how to behave, and also the structure of the law helped to bring the people into a clearer focus of the superiority of God. Okay, for an example, there were laws on how you should bring your sacrifice or your offerings to God. So there was structure put in place. God put the structure in place so that the people could have some form of being able to appreciate and accept the importance of God in their lives, the structure of God. You make your sacrifice because you recognize you get everything from God. So you make that sacrifice to show God that you appreciate that. So there were all those kinds of structures put in place, up to and including the kind of sacrifice that you would perform depending on the sin that you committed. Okay. What we're going to see later on in part of the New Testament is the transition from the law to and the structure of what you needed to do to understand and appreciate the connection and the closeness you have to God, to the New Testament, which focuses on our love of God and what is in our hearts, that we do what we do, not because that's the law, but because that's the love that we have in our heart for God. So we transition from law to love. Okay. Okay. So we understand that when the people heard Christ speak, Christ was speaking now with authority. And we know that since Christ's whole, um, his whole the existence was to show love, that would be included in some manner in his uh, in his preaching or in his teaching, even though we don't know exactly the topic. But when Christ spoke, Christ and the connection between the law, Christ is the fulfillment of the law. So the law is supposed to bring uh, believers or the Jews closer to God. And then Christ is the fulfillment of us being brought closer to God. And we are brought closer to God through Christ's sacrifice on the cross. Okay, I think that's deep. Okay, so now we're looking at evil spirits. Okay, so when they say evil spirits is equivalent to demons. You could also call them demons. You could call them evil spirits. You could call them bad angels, evil angels. Okay, and these demons are ruled by Satan. So, what is I'm going to do like a little perspective on the demons. So, what is the purpose of the demons, and how did they get created? Well, I'm going to do just a little quickie um, description of that. In heaven, there were angels that were created to worship God. Then you had the archangel Lucifer, who was very beautiful. And, well, I'll just cut long story short. Lucifer became arrogant and tried to compare himself as being equal to God. And God cast Lucifer, who is an angel, and all the angels that followed Lucifer out of heaven. Okay, so those are the demons and the angels who now are involved with tempting. Okay, and why do they tempt? They tempt us because now that they have lost, these bad angels have lost their connection with God, they want to break the connection of mankind to God. Okay, I guess that's kind of like a simplistic way of me saying it, but yeah, so their goal is to tempt mankind to sin. And when we sin, that interrupts our closeness and our connection with God. So now we look at one thing I do want to point out. When we look at the evil spirits or the demons that exist, they were not created by Satan. Only God can create. But God does use or allow the demons to do certain things. But it's not that God does them. He allows Satan and his demons to do certain things. Okay. And why is that permitted? That's permitted because God gives us choice. And it's up to us to choose good or evil. God can't do evil, so he allows Satan to do evil, but God controls Satan. Nothing happens without God's allowance of it. Okay. And then now the issue is, well, okay. Sometimes when some of those evil things happen, it's because we choose it knowingly, sometimes unknowingly, and sometimes it appears to us that we didn't choose it, but we're put in a position to make a choice. And hopefully we make the godly choice. Okay, so we've established that demons are fallen angels who participated in Satan's rebellion. And his rebellion was he refused to worship God and honor God. He was thrown out of heaven, and so were Satan's followers. Okay, now, this man who was in the synagogue had, he was possessed by evil spirits. And evil spirits could come in the form of causing a person to be mute, deaf, or insane or blind. And we'll see pretty often that during the ancient time of Christ, there seemed to be a lot of need for exorcism. But what we do know is that when Christ casts out the demons, that is a very powerful example of his authority, which I think is one of the reasons why Mark writes about exorcism so frequently, because it underscores Christ's authority over evil, authority over the demons. Okay, now that I mentioned the fact that demons, especially during that time, could cause a person to become blind or deaf or mute or something like that, it does not mean that if a person has one of those things, that's automatically from a demon. It doesn't mean that. So we might not, know the exact case. Okay. Okay. Let's look at the fact that even though demons do have the ability to do this, that God limits the ability and the power and the influence of all demons. Now, during Christ's time, as I was saying, demons were pretty common. And I believe that their being so common is the opportunity for Christ to be able to show his authority. And we know that uh, throughout his ministry, Christ shows his authority over demons through exorcism. Christ shows his authority over uh, nature by calming the waves of the ocean in a storm. Um, so there are four basic ways that Christ shows his authority on the earth. And we recognize that when you see the impact of being able to control a demon, it was very powerful. And it achieved the purpose that Christ wanted. People heard about it and it spread, the news spread, because nobody had seen anything like that before. Now, I'm going to say like that before because there were other people who wanted to perform exorcisms, and they did. And they used a number of incantations, and they went through a whole lot of procedures, and it seemed pretty impressive to a lot of people, but bottom line, they didn't do too much in really expelling demons. It was more like a show, but it wasn't really that successful. But with Jesus, he just said, come out. And that showed his control. One thing I wanted to mention, yes, demons were very active in a very open uh, format in those ancient times. But demons are very active today. Demons are the ones that tempt us to do wrong. So how are we tempted? When we talk about the spiritual things that we experience, it happens mentally. It happens with a thought. That's why sometimes it's difficult um, to get a handle on it. It's difficult to fight against it because it's in our thought process. So what we have to do is we have to stay constantly in a positive vein. Now, how do we stay in a positive vein? Through the scripture, through reading the positive things about God, about who God is, and then we can look at the impact of God on our lives. Satan's purpose, the purpose of demons who are under Satan is to separate us from the love of God. And how do we get separated from the love of God? Through sin. Because of the fact that we have Jesus within us, that helps us to not be taken over by Satan or by his demons. Why? Because we have a powerful adversary, and it's Jesus Christ. That's why we need God in our lives, because alone we're just a human being, and we are going against angels, evil angels, bad angels. And unless we have a powerful adversary, Jesus Christ, in our lives, we can't go up against that. Okay, so that's one point. Then the other thing is, though our souls cannot be taken over, we cannot be inhabited by Satan. We can be tempted. That's important. We can be tempted. And there's certain things, certain activities that we do that will make us spiritually weak. Okay. And one of those is being involved with fleshly related sins. That's immoral, with immoral activities. Okay. That's viewing immoral activities. That's being in negative environments, people who have bad morals, being around them. But there's also things like being involved in matters of the occult, being involved with fortune tellers and sorcerers. Those are all things that are abominations. And there's a common street that I take down a certain avenue. And every time I drive down that street, I see that fortune teller sign. Sometimes when we are in a position of uncertainty, we look for an answer. When we want to look for an answer, we go to God for an answer, because God is all powerful. But somehow, for some reason, people may choose to go to a satanic reading. And so then when we do something like that, it works in a negative way for us, because that looking to demons for information is looking to the opposite of who God is. It's like the opposite of God. We're going to him for advice. We're going to the opposite of God for knowledge on what's going to happen in the future. Oh, is this going to turn out okay? Or if God wanted us to know it, he would tell us. So there's some things that God does not want us to know. Some things that we are not supposed to be involved in, because it's really too heavy for us to get into. So that's why my suggestion is, if you do any of those things on a regular basis, just go directly to God and pray to God for your advice. Pray to God for your encouragement, and pray to God for wisdom, because that's the best way to get your answer. Okay. Well, I hope that you've gotten something from this session. Please remember to like and share, and uh, share this information with your friends. Talk about God. And I'll be visiting with you again next time. And may God bless.